it's Kira and welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be talking you through all of the books that I managed to read throughout the month of September. And saying that sentence, actually, all of the books I read, makes it sound like I have quite a few books to talk about, and I'm here to tell you I absolutely do not. Throughout the month of September, I managed to achieve my lowest reading month yet by reading a total of 3 books throughout the entire month. And so before we get into the actual wrap up and talking about my thoughts on those 3 books, I thought I'd just do a little bit of a chat about reading, productivity, and I guess the pressure that sometimes people feel when they are part of an online book community to read a certain amount each month. I often feel compelled when I've had a less successful reading month to sort of say, oh, I'm sorry I didn't manage to read that much, or oh my god, how bad is it that I only read 3 books? But actually that is just completely skewed and doesn't take into account everything else that I was getting up to throughout this month. So for example, in September, I started back full-time in the office, which was the first time I'd been back in the office since lockdown. So it was totally getting used to that new schedule, being back in the swing of the 9 to 5. And I also started teaching yoga for the first time. So I'd taken on 2 very time-consuming things on top of everything else, and I was also keeping up to my YouTube schedule of trying to upload 3 videos a week, and so naturally I just had a little bit less free time for reading, and that was obviously reflected in the fact that I read 3 books this month, and I think that last month I read 8 or 9 books, and that is completely fine. I feel like there's just this pressure to read a certain amount or feel like you're only a proper reader if you're ticking off 10 books a month, and I just wanted to let you know that that is absolutely not the case. I do get quite a lot of comments from people asking if I can give any advice on how to read more or how to just basically fit more reading in, and whilst a lot of the time I feel like I do manage to read a lot, that clearly doesn't always happen, and I think reading for me is something that I do for fun because I love it. I had that period of my life where I was reading as part of my studies because I was studying English literature, and at that point I had to prioritise reading as a task, something that had to be done, whereas since graduating I've been able to return to viewing reading as just something that I purely do for fun because I love it so much. And so when I have time to do it, it's amazing, but also it's a task that I think shouldn't have any pressure on it whatsoever. So if you are looking for tips to do more reading, my first tip would just be to fit it in if you can, and to think about your priorities. If reading is something that you really want to do more of, then make time for it, but also try to take it easy and just don't put pressure on yourself, because when I can, I do like to make time for reading, and as you'll see in things like 24-hour readathons, I can manage to read quite a lot in a short amount of time because on those specific days, reading is my top priority, whereas at other times in life, such as this last month, reading just hasn't been a priority for me and I've had other things to focus on. So I feel like I've started this video in the most rambly way possible, but really all I wanted to say is when I was going to start this video, I had this urge to be I had the worst reading month yet and it was only 3 books, and I think just prefacing it with only just makes it seem like it's somehow less than if I'd read more, and actually I read what I could read and I had a great time doing it, and that's all that matters. So if you ever watch BookTube or look at your own shelves and think about your own reading and think that you're not reading enough, all I would say is that if you are reading when you want to read and having a good time doing it, then you are reading absolutely the right amount for you. And so, motivational reading pep talk over, let's jump into my wrap up. I'd like to say it's probably going to be a short one because I'm only talking about 3 books, but let's be honest, it's me and I've already been talking for 5 minutes and I haven't even talked about any books yet. So without further ado, let's jump into my thoughts on the 3 wonderful books that I read in the month of September. So the first book that I picked up in September was one that was highly anticipated for me and was one that I was so excited to get to. It was released over the summer, I think in July, and since being released, it's one that has been talked about by so many people on BookTube, Bookstagram, Twitter, basically everywhere that people who like books congregate online. People were talking about this book and making it sound like such an interesting read, and just the title sounded so intriguing, and so it actually ended up being the Dark Academics Book Club pick pick for September, which meant that we had an opportunity to discuss this book in great depth, which I was so excited about. And I actually started the month out with this one because even though the live show wasn't until the end of the month, I was just so excited to get into it. So the book that I'm talking about is, of course, Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. I actually did feature this book in a reading vlog that I did right at the beginning of September, so I'll link that down below for you to check out if you want to see my thoughts as I was reading the book and what I thought, like basically going through the entire process. But to summarise, I loved it and gave it 5 stars. Of the people in the Dark Academics book club, I was the one who enjoyed this book the most. There were some 3-star reads, some 4-star reads, and I was the only 5-star read, so I obviously really enjoyed it. The live show for this one was over on Lucy's channel at the end of September, so again, I'll link that for you to check out if you want to hear everyone's thoughts from the book club, as well as some of the people who were joining in with the live show, their questions and their opinions, because it was a really interesting live show. I feel like the title of this book is so alluring because although it kind of tells you 2 key pieces of information, which is that it is set in Mexico and that it is a Gothic style novel, it also doesn't really tell you very much whatsoever, and I think it's more just suggestive of a kind of atmosphere that the book will provide, and that atmosphere was enough to lure me in because it just sounded so intriguing. And this was, I guess, my first read for the entirety of autumn because it was the first book that I picked up in September, and it was so incredibly perfect for setting that autumnal mood. So in this book we follow our main character Noemi. I had a comment which told me that you are pronouncing it with the emphasis on the me rather than the M, but I'm not entirely sure that I'm pronouncing it right. So we have our main character Noemi, and she is a socialite in Mexico in the 1950s. She lives in Mexico City, and she is kind of just living her best life, dating people, figuring out what she wants to do, studying, and just basically living quite a privileged existence. And then quite close to the beginning of the book, Noemi's father receives a letter from her cousin Catalina. Catalina lived with the family growing up, but recently got married and moved away to a much more rural place in Mexico. Noemi and her father didn't really know all that much about Catalina's new husband and his family, and so Catalina sends this letter which basically says that she thinks her husband is trying to poison her and that she needs help. So being a sensible man, Noemi's father decides that rather than going himself, he's going to send his young daughter out to this very extravagant old house called High Place to basically see what is going on. And so we follow Noemi as she goes to basically check in on Catalina and make sure that she's okay. And then when Noemi arrives at High Place, she is greeted by this very strange family. It's a while before she actually gets an opportunity to see Catalina, and the story that she is told by her husband and his family is that Catalina is suffering with TB, and so she is being looked after and very much monitored by the family, but they're very strict about how much Noemi can see her. So she stays with this family, and it very quickly descends into what can only be described as a classic haunted house style narrative, where it seems like not only is Catalina's new husband's family very odd, but the house that they're living in seems to be a character in and of its own right. Which I love because I think there's nothing better than when an author is really successfully able to characterize that which is not human. I just think it's so interesting when you can give either places, locations, or buildings such character that they actually take on a life of their own, and High Place, the house in this book, really does that. We very quickly see Noemi becoming isolated in this situation and really struggling with her sort of morality about whether to stay and protect Catalina, which is what she believes that she should do, and then her desire to escape from this situation entirely herself because she absolutely despises it. And so overall, I would say that what I love the most about this book is the fact that it is so atmospheric. It can be very gory, and I know certain people have actually had to stop reading this book because of how graphic it can be in its descriptions of bodily gore and things like that, and the way that it really delves into sort of the way that things happen with the human body, and it is quite upfront and graphic. However, I'm not someone who is particularly squeamish, and so that didn't bother me, and in fact it only added to the atmosphere. But if that is something that you don't particularly enjoy, then perhaps this is a book to maybe stray away from. But overall, I would say it is so dark and so atmospheric. Characterization in this book is potentially lacking. I feel like some of the characters do feel a little bit two-dimensional, and there are certain characters like Catalina who we don't ever really get that much of an opportunity to actually get to know very well. But overall, I would say that the atmosphere is what carries this story and makes it so interesting. And there were also certain surprising elements within this book, like some historical elements that really delve into the house, its history, and how it became to be characterized as it is. There are some elements which delve into sort of like botanical things, which I thought was really unique and interesting. And then the one that I enjoyed the most, which was potentially the more light-hearted side of the story, was the fact that there were some romantic elements put in there. Again, I think that's a part of the story that has been subject to like split opinions. Some people like it, some people don't, but I really liked it because I think it was a really nice addition to what was otherwise a very, very dark story, and it also gave you an opportunity to get to know some of the other characters a little bit better as well. I'm obviously not giving too much detail on that romance because I don't want to give any spoilers, but overall I would say that this book is a really wonderful gothic and atmospheric read. I wouldn't say it's particularly scary, but it is gory, gruesome, dark, and very, very compelling. And then changing the pace of my reading month completely, the next book that I picked up was The Switch by Beth O'Leary. This was another 2020 release and another one that I'd been really looking forward to, mostly because Beth O'Leary is the author of The Flat Share. That is a book which I read towards the end of last year and absolutely loved. And so as soon as I knew that she was bringing out this book this year, I was really, really excited to read it. And then my summer ended up being so busy that I didn't actually have much time to pick it up until now. But I'm so glad that I did, because especially having just read a really dark and creepy book, this was the perfect antidote. And I feel like those two books that I read at the start of September kind of sort of completely summarize everything that I love about autumn and autumnal reads. I find myself either reaching for those really dark, really creepy, spooky books, or these really cozy, light-hearted, heartwarming, and just generally like feel-good books. And I got both of those in September, which was wonderful. And like Mexican Gothic, this was also a 5-star read. The Switch is a book which focuses on two main characters. Both of Beth O'Leary's books so far have been dual perspective, and that is one of my favourite things about them. And whilst in her first book, The Flat Share, we look at the two perspectives of a romantic sort of relationship developing, we have a female and a male protagonist. In this book, we get something a little bit different because we follow a grandmother and a granddaughter. The book starts by introducing us to Lena, the granddaughter, who lives in London and is working for, I think, an investment bank. She's like climbing the career ladder, doing everything that people in their 20s kind of think that they should be doing, and she is like burning herself out and running on empty. She ends up making quite a big mistake in like a really important work meeting, and after that her boss pulls her aside and basically says that she isn't performing how she should be, and she knows that it's because she's running on empty and dealing with grief, which I'll explain in just a moment. And so then her boss basically says, you have no choice but to take 2 months off work and then come back to your usual self, essentially. And so like I said, Lena is dealing with grief because her sister Carla recently passed away after a battle with cancer. And I think having dealt with that grief, Lena's coping mechanism was essentially to throw herself even more intensely into work, and that obviously led her to burnout. And so that is our first perspective. And then the other perspective is the grandmother, Eileen. So Eileen lives in Yorkshire in a small village. She's very involved in the community. She's part of like the community like group who runs events and things, and she's just like a really key member of this village community. But her husband recently cheated on her and left her, and she is left sort of feeling like she wants to go on another adventure and basically take life by the horns and kind of like sort of find that bit of energy and zest for life that she knows is still within her, and of course try and find some romance. And so we kind of get introduced to these characters knowing that they are at a big turning point in their lives, trying to figure out who they are, what they want to do, deal with their issues, and also just find their like stride in life again, because both of them are feeling a bit lost. And so rather unconventionally, and as the title suggests, they switch lives. Not in the Freaky Friday sense as if they like bang heads and switch bodies, but in the sense that they decide to basically switch places and live in the other one's shoes. And so Eileen moves all the way down to London to live in Lena's flat with her flatmates and basically like pursue romance in London and just take this incredible adventure and basically just find some energy and zest for life again. Whereas Lena takes this incredible change of pace by moving up to live in a little cottage in a Yorkshire village, get involved in the community group, and essentially just take some time away from work to process and just think about what on earth she is doing. And I feel like this book is just so incredible in the way that it kind of walks that line between those more serious reads and reads that are just generally lighthearted and fun to get through. This is a book that I think you can get through really quickly. I think the fact that it is a dual narrative really helps with that because you're constantly switching perspective, and I feel like that just always makes a book move a lot more quickly. And yet one thing that really overrides this entire story is that Lena and her grandmother are both dealing with the loss of Carla, who is Lena's sister and of course Eileen's other granddaughter. And I think what this book does is explore grief in a way that really highlights how grief is such an individual experience that impacts everyone so differently. Whilst we don't actually get this other character's perspective, we are also introduced to the middle character, who is Lena's mum and Eileen's daughter, and she is obviously another key female character within the story and is of course dealing with the loss of her daughter. And so we have these three very connected female family members who are all dealing with grief so differently. And I think that is a really important narrative to have, because grief is something that I think will affect most people, well, everyone actually, at some point in their life. Everyone will deal with loss and grief. And I think this book really highlights that it is okay to deal with it in your own way and that everyone does have different coping mechanisms, but it also highlights how there is obviously a lot of negativity attached to wallowing in your grief, and how there is a time when you need to sort of step back into your own shoes and kind of like take life by the horns again and essentially just like take control back of your own existence. And I think it really does explore how grief is such an ongoing process and how at times you can feel like you're really making way with your grief and starting to progress through life again, and how something really small or seemingly insignificant can sort of pull you back down into the depths of grief. And I think it just really explores the emotional battle that people face in coming to terms with loss. And I guess overall what this book tries to achieve with grief, and I think achieves really well, is that it highlights that loss isn't something that goes away. It's something that you eventually have to learn to cope with, and that becomes a key part of your life that I guess shapes your existence going forward. But it also reminds you that there is a certain point where you have to then just like take that control back and move forward, knowing that you've been shaped and changed by grief, but not allowing that to keep you trapped in the past and wishing that what happened hadn't happened, because that will of course never happen, and the person you've lost will always be gone. So you have to, I guess, embrace your own life and move forward with it. And so in one sense we have this quite intense book which deals with such a serious topic and deals with the complexities of emotion that come with grief, but then we also have this really funny storyline where we follow Eileen through her dating journey in London as she gets on like dating websites, and it's just really fun and lighthearted, and you see this older woman really coming to terms with her own confidence and really sort of moving on from a marriage that didn't serve her, and able to sort of find a new sense of confidence and self-love and using that to pursue romance and recognizing romance as something fun. And we also see Lena dealing with quite a range of romantic things as well, which are slightly more complicated, and potentially I won't go into them because I feel like they're better to read about. But we just see this incredible combination of darker, more serious topics that I think really add depth and grit to the story and develop the characters to the point where they feel like people rather than just book characters. But then we also have these more fun, light-hearted elements that you'd expect from a romance book, and certainly that you'd expect from Beth O'Leary. and I just think it's such an incredible book. I wasn't sure if I was going to enjoy this one as much as The Flat Share because The Flat Share was so good, but this one was still really incredible, and I just love the way that she uses dual perspectives to really round out a story and just explore characters in such an interesting way. I'd also say that I wasn't expecting to enjoy the part that was set in this tiny Yorkshire village, mostly focusing on old people as much, but in actual fact some of those characters ended up being my favourites, and I just think there was such an incredible blend of characters, like I said, of serious topics and light-hearted ones, which just made a recipe for a truly incredible book. And then the final book that I picked up during September was a thriller that I actually started in July, didn't end up finishing then, and then restarted in September, and that was The Secret She Keeps by Michael Robotham. This is a book which focuses again on two main characters. I am a sucker for dual perspective books, and this always makes me enjoy books even more, and overall I gave this book 4 stars. The two characters that we follow in this book are both pregnant women. We have Megan and we have Agatha. Megan is someone who you'd potentially view as living an ideal life. She's married to a guy who is a TV presenter. They have 2 children already. They live in a lovely home. She lives quite a sort of like chilled out life. She's a blogger. She goes to like pregnancy yoga classes. She has loads of friends, and she is of course pregnant with her 3rd child, which she's really excited about. And then we have Agatha, who meets Megan when Megan comes into the supermarket that Agatha works in. And Agatha is someone who I guess views Megan as this person who has the ideal existence, whereas Agatha's life in terms of both her history, her family, her romances are just not quite as perfect. And then this book kind of flips that on its head and explores how perfection, and especially perfection as it is outwardly perceived by someone else viewing someone else's life as perfect, is often very far from the truth. And both of these women, as it transpires, have some pretty big secrets that they are harbouring. And as this book develops, these two characters have their lives gradually more and more intertwined, and their paths continue to cross in a way that becomes very messy and dangerous. Unfortunately, I feel like there's not very much else I can say about the plot of this book without giving away any spoilers, but I will say that this book did things that I definitely expected it to do. Reading a book about 2 women who are pregnant and keeping secrets, I kind of had a pretty clear idea about what I thought one of the secrets was going to be and where I thought the storyline was going to go, and I think from the beginning of the book, once you start getting to know the characters, it does become quite clear, but that doesn't take away from the enjoyment in my opinion, because it is still a really intense and thrilling read. Some of the things that it does are really surprising, and even when the things that are happening are quite sort of expected, I feel like you're still very much on your toes and very tense reading it, because you still don't know exactly what's going to happen, and the stakes are so high for all of these characters that regardless of how predictable the storylines might be, it's still a really compelling and intense and thrilling read. The one thing that stopped me from giving this book 5 stars was the fact that whilst I'd say 80% of this book was really intense, really thrilling and super compelling, and like the kind of book that I didn't want to put down, I found the ending to be quite anticlimactic and just not necessarily in keeping with the thriller genre. I found it a little bit disappointing, and I thought maybe the ending would have been the author's opportunity to take what could have been described as maybe a more predictable read and make it really surprising. But nevertheless, like I said, although some of the parts of this book were predictable, they were still really enjoyable to read and compelled you regardless of how predictable they were. So I'd still definitely recommend this book, and I'm really keen to read more by Michael Robotham going forward. So those are all 3 of the books that I read during the month of September, and whilst I didn't end up reading quite as many books as I might usually have, as I'm sure you'll be able to tell from the amount of love that I've shared for all of these books, I had an incredible reading month in terms of how much I enjoyed the books that I did read. If you've read any of the books that I read this month, I'd love to hear your thoughts on them and to know whether you enjoyed them as much as I did. If not, I'd love for you to tell me what was your favourite book that you read in September. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.